To give a little background, I used to be an academic, clinical and basic researcher at leading Australian hospitals and universities. But in the last many years, I decided to focus as an independent health researcher on prevention of chronic diseases with an interest in prevention. And my focus in the last 8 years has been on electromagnetic pollution, which is a serious global environmental health problem. Now, when it comes to electromagnetic pollution, radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation, or better known as wireless radiation, is the major part of this problem. But there are other forms of electromagnetic pollution as well. Now, radiofrequency transmitters used to be rare and distant objects until a few decades ago. And then in the 1980s and 90s, they started coming into our homes as microwave ovens and wireless phones. Still, the population, only a small proportion of the population was exposed to this type of radiation. And today, we have a situation where we carry radiofrequency transmitters on our bodies, even our children, and they constantly emit microwave radiofrequency radiation, which readily goes into our bodies. And there is evidence that shows that it's not only small creatures like bees that are dropping dead, being harmed by this type of radiation, but it's also harming us and our precious children. It is time that we paid serious attention to this problem. Let me first show you the magnitude of this electromagnetic pollution. Here we are looking at radiofrequency radiation only, wireless radiation. So the natural levels are extremely low, almost non-existent levels. And through the last decades, this is how much we have added this radiation to our environment. And at present, we are looking at about 10 to the 18, that is a billion times more radiofrequency radiation in our environment that we are exposed to constantly, especially around this 1 gigahertz frequency band that's been utilized for wireless communications. With 5G, you can expect this to get worse with more radio frequency added to our environment. So, the current exposure regulation is very poor. It is based on physics and artificial plastic heads like these, not real heads or biology. Unfortunately, the currently used exposure guidelines of pro-industry professional bodies like NICNIRP and IEEE only take into account short-term heating effects, that is for 6 or 30 minutes. They do not protect us against long-term effects or non-thermal effects. For my claim, here's the confirmation from the US EPA that recognizes that current exposure guidelines cannot protect us from long-term effects or non-thermal effects. What about biological effects that happen at low-intensity non-thermal exposures? These are documented in thousands of peer-reviewed scientific publications, and they're detailed in government reports, industry reports, and independent scientists, reports by independent scientists, and even the International Agency for Research on Cancer, an arm of the WHO, which in 2011 classified radiofrequency radiation as a possible human carcinogen. And there's absolutely no scientific consensus on the safety of, or the risk of electromagnetic pollution. And there are hundreds of expert scientists who have appealed to the WHO and the UN, urging for protection of public health from wireless radiation, to take steps to immediately reduce exposure and to introduce new biologically based exposure guidelines. And I urge you, if you haven't seen this International EMF Scientist Appeal, to check it out on the internet. Now, what about the biological effects, and how can they affect us? It's not a surprise that we are affected, because we are electrochemical beings. Bioelectricity drives every form of life on Earth. And it's been harnessed in both Eastern and Western medicine. For example, when an ECG is done, you're monitoring the electrical activity of the heart. The same way, an EEG monitors the electrical activity of the brain. And when we die, this bioelectricity is turned off for good. At a cellular level, we are made out of large numbers of these basic units, cells. This bioelectricity is generated by specialized proteins called ion channels or ion transporters. They're extremely sophisticated structures that have evolved over millennia. Now, interestingly, a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs that have gained blockbuster status in recent decades are acting on ion transporters. This indicates that a lot of the time the modern health problems are due to disruption of bioelectricity. That's interesting, isn't it? Now, biological interference occurs even with very short-term exposures. Here's an example. This was done at the National Institutes of Health, USA, very high quality data, and with healthy volunteers. As you can see, this is where the mobile phone was held, and these scans of the brain show that the glucose metabolism in brain tissue increased after mobile phone use compared to before. The darker, the more orange-yellow indicates increased glucose metabolism. We don't know the health consequences of this effect. However, there are some biological effects which are clearly adverse health effects. For example, in the immunology department of a Japanese hospital, they conducted a series of studies, and they were using young, healthy participants, and they compared with matched patients with atopic dermatitis, allergic dermatitis. And what they found was, after very short exposure, in that study it was only 60 minutes, and this study it was only 30 minutes, of exposure to a standard mobile phone, the test, objective clinical test, skin prick test as well as blood test, showed clearly, very clearly, the allergic responses were worsened by exposure to wireless radiation. This is proof. This is not just evidence. This is proof of harm. And we have a situation where the world population is increasingly having allergic immune disorders. And when you look at the evidence, this is clearly a risk factor. This is a basic schematic of an animal cell. These are extremely complex structures where thousands of components, structural components, and there are thousands of chemical components that need to act in perfect harmony like an orchestra to keep us healthy and to keep us alive. When cell biologists examine the effects of wireless radiation on cells, they find effects on each and every different components of cells. Long-term biological interference at cellular level causes dysfunction and loss of coordination, dysfunction of basic biological functions, and in turn lead to diseases and disorders. Now, looking at the scientific evidence, at ORSA, Australian scientists who are volunteering their time to investigate the health impact of wireless technology, they have built the world's largest database, largest categorized database of peer-reviewed studies. And they are mostly new. We have mostly published since the year 2000. And they our database contains at the moment more than 3,000 studies. And anyone can freely access it from any part of the world and assess the scientific evidence. Now, early this year, we did analysis of experimental studies. There are different types of studies, and the experimental studies included cell culture studies, animal studies, some limited human studies, and population studies. And what we found was 68% of 1,955 studies to be positive for biological effects. This is very strong evidence, and it completely rejects the claim that wireless technology is safe and risk-free. It is not. Scientists have reported that wireless radiation, radiofrequency radiation, can cause oxidative stress, which increases the risk of chronic diseases like cancer and dementia. And oxidative stress being one of my key interests in academic research, I decided to investigate this with a colleague. Now, let me first give you a bit of an introduction to what oxidative stress is. Oxidative stress is contributed by specific chemical species called reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species mainly. And they are pro-oxidants. They oxidize cellular components. It's a bit like oxidizing metals, like rusting process. Our cellular components can get rusty when they're oxidized. So what happens is our cells have evolved defense systems against oxidation, against oxidative stress, and they are antioxidants. We all know when we eat lots of fruits and veg, we consume antioxidants to combat oxidative stress. So the balance between oxidant species and the antioxidant species need to be maintained. It's called redox homeostasis. It is critical for cells to remain healthy and for us to remain healthy. A disruption in favor of more pro-oxidant species causes oxidative stress, and that damages our cells, including our genetic material, DNA. So what happens is, like rusty metal, rusty tools, when we accumulate oxidative damage, we become weak and dysfunctional. We develop, we go through aging process faster, and we succumb to chronic diseases more easily. So when we looked at the scientific papers on oxidative stress, what we found was 89% of 242 studies to show oxidative stress. That is very strong evidence, confirming a previously published review. Now, these studies had come from 29 countries, and most of them are fairly new, published since 2010. So this is new knowledge. And most of them were done on whole animals, including some human studies, and that is very strong evidence. So, from biological effects to health effects, we now know that radiofrequency radiation can cause oxidative stress. There are the effects too. And oxidative stress can be caused by ionizing radiation and a lot of toxic chemical exposures. And that causes ongoing cellular damage. And this disruption can also impair important, in this case, melatonin, a very important hormone. And it can, the disruption can impair immune function, metabolic function, hormone function, and different types of dysfunction lead to multi-system effects, multi-system dysfunction, and eventually to chronic diseases and accelerated aging. DNA damage it's well known to be caused by oxidative stress, and currently there are some 120 studies on our database that show radiofrequency radiation can cause DNA damage. Here's one example from a highly well-conducted study at the University of Vienna. I don't want to go into the details of the assay, but if you look at a cell that has intact DNA, intact genetic material, you see something like this. And here's the positive control with the cell a cell that's been exposed to a very high level of ionizing radiation. And when the DNA is damaged, physically damaged, fragmented, what you see is like the tail of a comet, and that's why it's called the comet assay. And the test exposure was for mobile phone radiation for 24 hours. And as you can see, there's clearly DNA damage, there's DNA fragmentation, our genetic material being physically broken down. And this finding has been subsequently confirmed by a large number of other studies, not just in cells, but also in whole animals. You know, DNA damage can lead to cancer. And here's the latest world cancer map. The diagnosis rate of new cancers out of 185 countries. Now, the darkest blue represents the higher rates. Unfortunately, my country, Australia, has the world's highest cancer diagnosis rate. I'm not proud of that at all. But as you can see very clearly, cancer hotspots in the world are westernized, Western industrialized countries, the most affluent countries, most technologically advanced countries have the highest cancer rates. Unfortunately, even the underdeveloped or developing countries, which traditionally had much lower cancer rates, are rapidly catching up with the West with increasing cancer rates. And there are very interesting observations too, and it's not very clear. I wish we had less light here, but if you look at, one comparison was between South Korea and North Korea. The very similar, genetically very similar populations, and there's a big difference you can't really see here. And it's the same I found Uruguay, which has increased cancer rate, and I just thought, oh, what's there? I just did a bit of research, and I found it's the country in the whole world to give a laptop, to every school student, for, the first country in the world. So very technologically pushed and advanced society. So it's good to have a look at the big picture, and certainly in Australia we have very high radio frequency exposure levels from measurements and published studies as well. And the evidence suggests that this is one factor for the high cancer rates. Now, just going on the radio frequency radiation and cancer. Well, the IARC, has classified it as a possible human carcinogen, and now scientists have presented evidence to show that it should now be classified as a class 1, an established carcinogen. And the evidence comes from different lines. Experimental studies on animals, and the latest, you may have heard the National Toxicology Program of the US, NIH, and also the Ramazzini Institute of Italy conducted large animal studies which found evidence of cancer and DNA damage in the NTP study. And also there have been earlier studies like Germany, Australia, and US, and these studies are collectively showing that radiofrequency radiation can induce cancer, increase the cancer risk in animals. And then there are population studies, studies that looked at brain cancer associated with wireless phone use, and also studies that looked at cancer rates around fixed RF transmitters like broadcasting towers or mobile phone towers. Now, just briefly, I'm just going to go through some of these slides fairly quickly. Basically, we have several case control studies that investigated mobile and cordless phone use and brain tumor risk. And we have a good recent meta-analysis from Poland that confirms the finding that long-term use of a wireless phone increases the risk of a brain tumor. And these studies all found, in different countries, found increased cancer risk near radio frequency transmitters, and they can be radio towers, TV towers, or mobile phone base stations. One of the latest studies come from Brazil. In this study, academic researchers looked at cancer deaths in a large city over a 10-year period and mapped these cancer deaths to their mobile phone base stations in that city. And what they found was, when they analyzed 7,191 cancer deaths, most of them have occurred within 500 meters of a mobile phone tower. And there was a steady increase in the cancer death rate as, with proximity to the mobile phone base stations. Closer to the towers, the higher the cancer death rate. Of course, population studies like this one, they don't provide proof. We can't say just because those cancers occurred near the towers that the tower caused the cancer. However, these sort of reports are much more convincing. These reports from doctors in the US, where they found multifocal breast cancers in young women, where they kept their mobile phones tucked in their bras. And these women did not have a genetic predisposition or other risk factors for breast cancer. So these were very unusual multiple breast cancers directly where the mobile phones were held. So these are very concerning, and doctors need to be aware of this knowledge. These studies come from India. In fact, there were a few studies. The academic researchers took blood samples from healthy young people who live near mobile phone towers and compared them to the blood samples from people away from towers, living away from mobile phone towers. And what they found was these healthy young people who live near mobile phone towers have more oxidative stress and they have more DNA damage. These are very concerning findings. Unfortunately, this type of studies have not been conducted in any of the developed Western countries. We definitely need to do this type of studies. And it seems that the World Health Organization had previous knowledge linking radiofrequency radiation to cancer and heart disease. I've got this from a US military medical report. What it says is, I'll read it out. In response to earlier Soviet reports, the World Health Organization decided to conduct a comprehensive study on the biological effects of exposure to radiofrequency microwave radiation. In 1976, MZAREC published the results of the study. The WHO investigation focused on population of North Karelia, a remote area of Finland that borders the Soviet Union. This region was selected because of its close proximity to then Soviet early warning radar station. So anyway, it actually says that this radar exposed the North Karelian people to high levels of radiofrequency radiation. And this is the interesting part. It says, the WHO investigation found evidence linking exposure to radiofrequency microwave radiation to cardiovascular disease and cancer. The North Karelian population suffered from an unusually high number of heart attacks and cases of cancer. In addition, it was found that the affliction rate of these diseases was much higher among residents living closest to the radar site. So, the interesting thing is, North Karelia project is a very well-known initiative of the WHO. What they did was they introduced a dietary intervention to the North Karelian people by encouraging them to eat a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, and that improved their health statistics. In fact, when I checked in 2016, there was something like 190 scientific publications on the North Karelia project. But when I checked, not a single one mentioned the radiofrequency exposure. The North Karelia project was very much on the dietary aspect, but there was no mention of the radiofrequency exposure, which was likely to be the cause of that high cancer and heart attack rates. Also, the fact that the dietary intervention with increased fruits and vegetables in the diet indicates that antioxidants did help, which means that oxidative stress is the cause or a cause. And linking this old information with the latest scientific information we now have, we can be certain that radiofrequency radiation at very low levels cause oxidative stress, cause DNA damage, and increase our risk to chronic diseases like cancer and heart disease. Now, just want to reflect on the brain, the control center of us. The brain tissue is highly protected even from the rest of our body. What enters the brain is very strictly controlled. Only some things can enter the brain tissue from blood, and this is done by what's called blood-brain barrier, a very robust, stringent filtration system. It does not allow a lot of things to enter the brain which can harm the very important brain tissue. Radiofrequency radiation at very low levels can damage the blood-brain barrier and expose our brain cells to various toxic exposures. It has been found in recent years that even a single drop of blood, if it enters the brain, can increase the risk of autoimmune processes and lead to conditions such as multiple sclerosis. So, damage to the blood-brain barrier is a serious issue. And of course, when we look at oxidative stress in brain tissue, we know that neurodegeneration is likely, and with the consequence of increased risk of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, these neurodegenerative diseases. And the leaky blood-brain barrier, of course, can increase the brain's susceptibility to environmental pollutants as well. So we have serious issues with wireless radiation and brain cells. And this is particularly a problem in young children, when experts have now claimed that there is a pandemic of developmental neurotoxicity, and they are claiming that to control this pandemic, we have to have global prevention strategies. Absolutely. Prevention is extremely important, but it is largely neglected at present because the health system is very much focused on finding a cure, medication and various other interventions, and there's very little focus on prevention. But it's very important for us to identify the causes of harm and protect ourselves and our precious children from these dangers. Now, these are Australian data looking at the health burden of children. Unfortunately, neuro-behavioural disorders like anxiety disorders, suicide and self-harm, these are the biggest health burden to children in our society. It's very sad. And when we look at the evidence, it's around us. We can see that these days children get exposed to the toxic wireless radiation right from the fetal stage, right through early years of life. And there is evidence, there are these studies showing that radiofrequency radiation exposure can alter brain development and behavior and put children at risk of neurobehavioral disorders. I wouldn't go into details, but these are again scientific studies that found these neurobehavioral or cognitive effects. And these studies conducted in different countries found neurobehavioral symptoms in people who lived near radiofrequency transmitters, mobile phone towers or radar towers or broadcasting towers. So collectively, we have quite a lot of scientific evidence showing that this radiation exposure is causing some serious health issues. Now, I want to touch upon the reproductive damage. We have evidence accumulating that show the human sperm is extremely sensitive to wireless radiation. This was a review, an Australian review done in recent times. They looked at 27 separate studies and they found 21 of them to find damage to male reproductive tissue. And this is not just to, it's important to note that we have to protect reproductive tissue from wireless devices. And this does not apply to males only. It's very important to protect female reproductive organs, not to have these devices on the lap or on the, children have them on their bellies often, and little girls carry all the eggs they will need for their reproductive years already, from birth, and they need to be protected. So this last but not least, I want to actually step out of the radio frequency research and get you to have a look at the big picture. I don't know whether you have read about this. This report called Limits to Growth was published in the early 1970s by a think tank at the MIT called Club of Rome. What they did was they analyzed big data and they tried to predict the trends for the future. So what they did was they had data from 1900 to 1970. So they are in the solid lines, and the dotted lines were their predictions for future. And they looked at different parameters. Say for here, we have population data here, how it's increasing. So what they actually predicted was the Western style industrialization was going to take us through rapid development, human society through rapid development. But they said, this is not sustainable. If we go in the current mode of industrialization, which they call the business as usual model, they predicted that the civilization will collapse because it's not sustainable. Back in the 1970s, or later, a lot of people thought, they rubbished this study and they said it is a doomsday fantasy, and they said it's not going to happen. Especially those who like capitalist development, they didn't want to see that sort of pessimistic predictions. In 2014, Australian academics at the University of Melbourne wanted to see if the predictions of the MIT think tank were correct. So what they did was they plotted data from 1970 to 2012. And it's not very clear, but the bold lines are the latest data plotted by the Melbourne scientists. And it is very concerning because the limits to growth predictions were very accurate. So what we're looking at is population to Where's my laser dot? So population to increase, but after about 2030, a rapid decline in the population. Death rate has been coming down, and what they're predicting is the death rate to go up. And I would encourage you to have a close look at this limits to growth graphs and the subsequent work by the University of Melbourne researchers, and think about what this may tell us. If those predictions are correct, what we are looking at is a massive collapse in our human civilization in the coming decades. It is challenging times for us in the 21st century. We have to take an evidence-based approach to decision making, and we have to consider environmental pollution, not only from electromagnetic radiation, but also chemical pollution, together, collectively. It has the potential to bring our civilization down. As you know, throughout the history, civilizations have advanced and then collapsed due to war or natural disasters. In the 21st century, it is entirely possible that abuse of technology, overuse abuse of even wireless technology can bring about a massive biological and ecological disaster. We have to be prudent. We have to make wise decisions now, because what we do today, the decisions we make today, will determine our own survival. Thank you. And I should say, dziękuję bardzo za uwagę. Thank you.